Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 22. I'm your host, Glenn Davis, and our guest this evening is going to be Quintin Mecke, a candidate for mayor here in San Francisco. Before we speak with Quintin, though, I want to thank everybody for their comments regarding last week's show with Paul Hogarth of BeyondCron.org and Tenderloin Housing Clinic, and let you know that the phone lines are open, and we'll hopefully have time to take a couple of calls, so please give us a call if you have any comments or questions for Quintin. And all right, so now we'll get started. Quintin, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you as well, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks
very much
for having me on.
Yeah, so let's start. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I've lived in San Francisco probably about a little over 10 years. Was originally, back in the day, a Peace Corps volunteer.
Right.
And after the Peace Corps, I came here to San Francisco. Since then, I've had a series of community-based and public policy sort of jobs. I've worked on several campaigns, including Supervisor Amiano's 1998 campaign, the last citywide supervisor election that we had.
Wow.
Through the work with Tom Amiano, he then introduced me to Matt Gonzalez. I then helped out on Matt's supervisorial campaign in 2000. After that, ended up on working and debated then Supervisor Newsom against Care Not Cash. That transitioned into working for Matt again in 2003, directing a lot of his public policy. And now I currently direct a public safety program here in the city that does community organizing around crime and violence issues, as well as inspect homeless shelters here in the city.
Right. And you have a public policy degree from San Francisco State?
Yes,
right?
I have a master's degree in public administration.
Oh, public administration.
Yep.
So now that we have your background, why did you choose to run for mayor in this election?
Well, I realized, Glenn, that at some point that I had a different vision and or idea of what San Francisco can be and should be than the current administration and Mayor Newsom. Having said that, I didn't necessarily expect to be sitting across from you 7 weeks ago.
Right.
And I mean that in the sense that having worked for Ross Mercurimi's campaign, Matt Gonzalez, Tom Amiano, I was part of conversations earlier this year where there were people asking whether it was Chris Daly or Matt or Art Agnos, we need you to run. Mark Leno was approached.
Right.
Is there going to be someone progressive to stand up for some of the issues that are not being addressed right here in San Francisco? Obviously, we got close to the August 10th deadline.
Right.
I started to talk with folks and said, is there anyone running, at least going to be strong on the issues? Let's talk about some real things.
Right.
And the answer was no. And as I said to my mother, who asked me with a sort of incredulous look on her face, I said to her, why'd you run for mayor? And I said, well, my principles got the best of me.
Right.
And that's really what it came down to, is the fact that from what I see right now, we're becoming a tale of two cities. There's an increasing large number of folks who can afford to live here, can afford to go to the opera, can afford to go downtown. And then there is, unfortunately, a large population of, whether it's the Tenderloin, Western Addition, Bayview, of marginalized communities, predominantly communities of color, that are not getting the services. They're experiencing high rates of crime, violent crime especially. Homicides are a 36% increase in the last 4-year period. I work in public safety. These are two issues, homelessness and public safety, that are the things I'm most comfortable talking about, that I know the most about. And so
I
felt
it every day, right?
Every day. So I figured I might as well step into the race and, in the true belief of democracy, put my money where my mouth is.
Right. Right. What has been before we get in, I'd like to talk about your platform, but how has the response been? I know you've gotten some endorsements of some key clubs here in the city.
So I've gotten some, the endorsements, I'll tell you, it's been very pleasantly surprising in the sense that there are still groups, regardless of the funding, regardless of the image, the poll numbers, etc., who have stood out to say, we're going to define what progressive is.
Right.
We're going to actually say that San Francisco can do better. So this week it was the Bay Guardian, it was the Harvey Milk Club, it was Supervisor Daly, it was David Campos from the Police Commission, Tom Radulovich from the BART Board. These are folks on the left, leaders in their own right, who are taking a stand to say that, listen, these issues are not being addressed. So it's been interesting. I think as far as the Democratic clubs, there was a good stretch there where either I would go to these clubs and present either before Mayor Newsom or right after him. And held him to a draw. No endorsement. That was the Sunset Democratic Club, the Young Democrats, the Richmond District Democratic Club, the Municipal Executives Association, which was covered on the front page of the Chronicle. And it was amazing because if you look at the dynamic of, there is a theoretically very popular mayor, right? The golden boy of the Democratic Party, right? I'm a director of a nonprofit.
Right.
Right? So you would think that it would be a no-brainer, endorsement hands down.
Right.
But I think what it really speaks to is underneath the funding, underneath the popularity or otherwise, if you go into the neighborhoods, people are not satisfied with what's happening. There's a general discontent. I'm not necessarily naive enough to tell you that's going to be completely reflected in the polls.
Right.
But having said that, the whole issue, though, is people want to be engaged about the issues. They want to feel like their government's engaging them. They want to feel like they have access to the mayor. Mm-hmm. And at this point, they don't. And so I think that once they were provided with a credible alternative that was going out and talking about the issues. I think it was interesting that the SF Weekly did a story where they interviewed someone at the Sunset Democratic Club, and they said, so what happened?
Right.
And the guy said, well, Quintin talked about the issues. Newsom came in after him and kind of talked about something, but it wasn't the issues, right?
Right.
And he said, so when it came time to endorsements, people kind of looked around and said, actually, we expected a little bit more.
Right. It's nice that they truly think about what direction the city is going in,
right,
and aren't kind of eyes aflutter based on the mayor coming in and
right,
giving his speech or whatever he speaks about.
Right.
But I have heard in my community that while they think the mayor is responsive, he's not necessarily engaged.
Right.
And that when it comes time to go home, Gavin's going to go to where Gavin can go and everything's all right for Gavin.
Right.
But for the people that need that help, that they, who need crime to be solved, need Muni to work, that's they're going to be left out.
Right.
So.
Well, no, and it was widely covered that the mayor asked Greg Fortner, head of the Housing Authority, resign.
Right.
Congratulations, 3.5 years we've waited for reform from the Housing Authority. Now, only because he just discovered that there's issues with the Housing Authority? 3.5 years into his administration? Right. It's stunning that we're sitting here having this conversation now. The idea that he's going to get credit for asking Greg Fortner now to leave is a little bit amazing in my mind. I mean,
everybody wanted him out 3 years ago.
Well, I mean, everyone has known there's issues with the Housing Authority. You go to the Board of Supervisors, you talk to them. I mean, if there's a locus of crime and violence, it's because of the conditions of the Housing Authority, the poor management. So the idea that now, he has this political cover to ask everyone to resign, and Greg Fortner happened to say, well, I'm actually not going to. Was the only, and then it became obviously he was a targeted one. I think it's just an interesting model of management. Yeah.
Right. So, well, I think we've delved into the issue. So let's key in on housing. What would you do differently than this mayor in terms of reform that you were just speaking about, and getting Mr. Fortner out seems to be a good thing. Yeah. So what would you do to correct the situation?
Well, and then there's two aspects to that. There is the public housing authority aspect, which I think that there are at least probably close to 1,000, if not more, vacant units, boarded up units within the housing authority properties. They need to be obviously renovated and have people in those housing units. The second part of that then speaks to more of the planning issues, right? What are we developing in San Francisco? Yeah. And I think that when you look at those issues even a bit more, if you go to downtown, it's the Millennium Towers. Right. 300-unit condo building that's 20 stories high. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, Glenn, but I'm not living there. None of my friends are living there.
I won't be living there anytime soon.
Right, and so it's one of those situations where you look in the long term, and it's very clearly if what you build is who will come. Right. And so the more that we build high-rise condos, then that's the demographic we're either creating or asking for in the future. Right. So I think first and foremost, the planning department currently has a policy where if you build development, and as long as you make the minimum, you meet the minimum affordability requirements, then that's fine. Right. And there's no other ask of the developer otherwise. And I think this whole format of trusting the market, that the market will cure everything. Right. If there's one thing we've learned, especially after 8 years of George Bush, is the market will not cure everything. Right. Inequity is growing in this town, and I think that we need to move beyond sort of this trusting idea that let developers tell us what's best for the city. And that their development ideas will certainly cure all of our social ills. So I think we need to aggressively address that, in addition to really setting the bar a bit higher about comprehensive long-range planning. Mm-hmm. We need to have a conversation about what does San Francisco look like 10 years from now, beyond Gavin Newsom, beyond the whatever the situation is. Who do we think needs to live here? Who do we think should live here? And And I think that right now we're pricing out our own residents, which is an amazing thing for a city to do. And yet there's this idea that if you can't afford to live here, well, you might as well go to Antioch.
Right. Go to the outer rim.
Go to the outer rim, right? And then you can kind of commute to your job. And I think, really? Is that kind of the San Francisco that we're talking about? Because of all places, I mean, the one thing I think back when you asked why I ran for this office was the fact that this is San Francisco. We're not talking about some sort of generally historically conservative city.
Right, like Indianapolis.
No, we're talking about a progressive place that really needs to stand up for itself and say, especially in a national context, we should be driving a conversation of changing how people view what modern cities are.
Right. Where I mean, the opposite is happening because, as you just said, you build it and those who can afford it can come.
Right.
And that pretty much wipes out, or what I perceive with what's being built, will pretty much wipe out diversity in San Francisco.
Oh, completely.
And that's what San Francisco rests on. I mean, everybody always says, "Oh, the diversity. I'm here for the diversity. I love the diversity."
Oh, and it's become a buzzword. But then you realize that if you price out those folks that are quote unquote the diverse population, right? Yeah. Then there's less culture, and less culture means a less interesting city.
Right.
And in the end of the day, I don't necessarily want to live in a less interesting city. Why I love San Francisco is not only the diversity,
right,
but we need to even get beyond that buzzword.
Right.
And to really sit down and say, what sort of cultures are we embracing and engaging, and not just sort of have this place become a place for the well-off.
Right.
Right.
Which we see quickly becoming.
Completely becoming.
And you made a good point about letting the market kind of set the standard or push the agenda. And I agree with you that that's wrong, that, you know, the market doesn't take into account the global view of everybody. It takes into account, you know, those who can. And that's it, not you know, anybody else. So let's move on to public safety. I know you have a lot of ideas for public safety and a lot of issues you want to address.
Yeah. Well, and public safety has been interesting because you would think that despite what the reality on the street is, that things are fine if you listen to Room 200, the mayor's office. In the last 4 years, we have had about 300 and close to 360 homicides. Right. That's a 36% increase from the previous 4-year period. We're on pace this year, currently as of, I think it's 88 or 89 homicides, to break 100 for the first time since 1993. Wow. Now, out of those homicide victims, what's interesting about that fact is that 60%, if not a little bit more than 60%, are African American. Mm-hmm. Now, to provide context for that, African Americans make up 6% of the population. So you have 6% of San Francisco's population bearing the burden of over 60% of the homicides in this town is unheard of. Yeah. If that had been happening quite honestly, in Pacific Heights, if that had been happening in any other neighborhood, we would be calling it an epidemic. Right. We'd be calling it a crisis. We'd have the police department on extra duty. And yet, there's no conversation. And the devaluing of that life, the devaluing of those folks in Bayview, in Viz Valley, in Western Addition, is the untold tragedy of what's happening in San Francisco.
And just that, does, in your opinion, would that tie into the same thing of the developers and the power makers at City Hall keying into, we're going to build these, 500-foot buildings with X number of condos, and this is the people we want, and those are the people that we're not really worried about?
I think it kind of speaks for itself, unfortunately, is the fact that that we're not having that conversation really speaks, quite honestly, to exactly that dynamic, which we'll build for different folks. We're not building lots of low income affordable housing in the Bayview or otherwise. We're just sort of laying that process. We let housing authority just kind of rot on the vine, and no one's really had a conversation about it. In the meantime, we're having large scale development downtown. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're investing in these neighborhoods to cure the issue. And I think what's sort of for me in running this race has been a bit of a gut check is really trying to get people to move past this voter apathy and to really engage the fact of what makes this town special. Shouldn't be the average. I've had people tell me, isn't that always the case? Communities of color having problems with violence in other cities? And I'm like, really? Like that? We're just going to sort of just let that issue kind of like roll off as if like that always happens, homicides, it's such a shame. Oh, well, there's gang problems. And I'm thinking like, yeah.
And then I also hear it's, the rise in the crime rate and death, that it's nationwide. So there's really nothing. It's really something they have to deal with on the national level.
Well, I think, and the response to that is what's interesting is that the mayor in his role is chief executive. he is ultimately in charge of the police department. Now, what we have right now is there is no community policing in San Francisco. Now, it's a buzzword that's been thrown around.
Right.
But what that means is sincerely engaging the community in how they want to be policed and letting them participate in the process. Because law enforcement is first and foremost, it's how each one of us experience, a cop pulls you over. You either feel comfortable that things are going to be all right for you,
right,
or your first thought is, you know what, I've been through this again, and I'm going to get jacked, right? They're just going to treat me poorly, and that reaction...
That's how I feel.
Is what happens, right, in communities of color, especially when there's patterns. And so if we don't have a police department, and having said this, I work very closely with the PD,
right,
there are some really strong community policing captains. It's not across the board, though.
Right.
And so what you have in San Francisco with 10 different police districts is 10 different versions of policing. You go from the Mission to the Park District to the Southern District, and each of them will tell you a different version of how they believe the community wants to be policed. Some of them want to have a conversation, some of them don't.
Right.
And so that institution really needs to sort of shift a little bit and engage things differently, because unless we have different policing, we just have a situation where there's no trust between communities of color and the police department. They can't obviously get witnesses for some of the crimes they committed because people don't trust them.
Right.
And unless we acknowledge it, what's interesting about all these issues is that because the current administration doesn't acknowledge them, we actually can't create solutions. Because it's actually until we prompt a conversation, then you and I can discuss it. But if you're not going to admit there's a problem, and I don't admit there's a problem,
right,
we can never actually have the discussion.
And was that, I think I read it somewhere, you have a strategy for redesigning neighborhood councils, or...
Right now, exactly. Right now we have, each district is required to have what's called a PCR, which is a police community relations meeting.
Right.
Now, you can go to some of those meetings and there'll be 40 people. You can go to some other meetings and there'll be 3.
Right.
The idea that there are districts in this town, given everything that's happening,
right,
and the one I'm speaking of is specifically in Western Addition, there are 3 or 4 that come to the Northern Western Addition meeting, right?
Where a lot of the issues are.
Right, and I think that we need to find some way of creating a different community engagement model of where we institute in every place there are councils, however we want to reframe it, but that there's a set way for people to feel like their feedback gets heard into the process, and that there's sort of a relationship between them, not sort of a top-down hierarchical, government will tell you how it is, you kind of yell up at them and say, we want something different.
Right.
And, that model's a little bit old, and it's San Francisco. So I think that whether it's community policing, if you could, and I've asked this question to a lot of people, do you know offhand the anonymous tip line number?
I don't.
And that exactly itself, right, is the fact that it's not as if it's 1-800-HELP, 1-800-TIPS, right?
Right.
We're sitting here. Now, if you went and saw something and you felt, oh, my God, I don't want to say anything because I feel for myself, right?
Yeah.
No one knows the tip number.
Right.
And I think that speaks volumes to it. Like, you walk around outside, the average citizen doesn't even know how they would... 911's not anonymous. 311's not anonymous.
Right. Although 311 is ironically the one that's pushed.
Oh, completely.
All the time. So
it's just, we have an odd dynamic that really speaks to the fact that I don't think that there's any vision.
What is the anonymous tip line?
575-4444, which is kind of an odd number.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's like a television, like...
555-1212, right? So the classic sort of information line. And I think it speaks more to the fact that there's just not a vision of where we're going and how we're going to get there. Because I'd like to participate as the average citizen.
Right.
I'm happy to use my skill set and my ideas and policy and knowledge and otherwise to say, if you told me, Quintin, this is where we're going, I need you to do blank, right? We want to create a more equitable society. More than happy to participate. I don't hear that message. So since I don't know, I'm sitting here in front of you to make sure that we can plant some seeds along this way to make sure that people start to engage the city a little differently and don't necessarily just roll over to the idea that things are all right, because they're not.
Right. So we touched on housing, transportation, public safety. Any other issues or pieces of your platform that you want to speak? We have about a couple minutes before we wrap up.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, for me, at least in my experience, is homelessness.
Right.
I think we need to move beyond sort of a failed policy of care not cash.
Right. So a question about care not cash. Now, would you say, and I know you debated them back in the day, would you say that care not cash has failed or care not cash has had some limited success?
It depends on how you want to define success.
Right.
Now, care not cash, despite its name is essentially welfare reform.
Right.
It's a localized version of what they signed in 1996, which is make sure we're not going to give you money anymore, Glenn. We're going to give you $60 a month and a couple services,
right.
and then potentially maybe housing at some point. We don't know. Housing, of course, let's also define housing, an SRO room in the Tenderloin.
Right. It's not adequate housing.
It's not housing that you or I would say, hey, where are you going? Back to your apartment? No, I'm going back to my room. I have a hot plate, and there's a bathroom down the hall.
Right.
And I think that we've lowered the bar for what we're doing to our most vulnerable folks in the society. And that, to me, is unacceptable, especially in the context of having, when I go out in the shelters, I meet veterans from Iraq. I've met victims of Katrina, people who had health care crises. Yet the current administration, and even Mayor Brown before that, more than happy to have the average citizen focus on the fact that, well, who's that guy defecating in your corner? That's homelessness. That's the image that sticks with everybody. And, oh, my God, like, clean it up, get rid of it, right? It's not humanizing the issue. It's not saying, I want to understand how you got to where you're getting, what happened to you, and where can we help you.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, and I don't mean to be fickle by saying that's interesting, because it is very interesting. And
Be fickle, it's okay.
Yeah. Nice tie, by the way. I just
Thank
want to say before we wrap up. I had one question. I don't know if we can get it in, because we got about 10 seconds, but the recent policy to sweep south of Market seems kind of like it's not care, not cash, it's care or else.
Right.
Any
or
thoughts?
it's Matrix Revisited. I mean, we went through this with Frank Jordan in the early 90s.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Where cops were doing outreach.
Right.
In my mind, police don't do outreach.
Right.
Social workers do outreach.
Right. Yeah, police aren't trained to do outreach either. So.
No, and I think that, of course, the dynamic is if you don't accept what the police say, then what are they going to do? They're going to put you in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, anyways, I appreciate you coming on. We've got about 13 seconds. I wish we had another half hour. I really enjoyed
yeah, no, it's good talking with you.
Speaking with you, yeah. So, maybe, if we'll have time sometime in the future, come back on. But thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bang.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish we did have another half hour, because we just kind of scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And that's one of the pains of this 20.